and I would like to welcome you to another episode of The Charm of It, a podcast for knitters who share my fascination with the nitty-gritty details of our craft. If you're a returning viewer, it is so nice to see you again, and if you're a new viewer, I'm really glad that you found your way to my little corner of the internet. You already saw my cat, Moth, and there's Thistle, my dog, licking the comforter. Been working on trying to get her to stop licking the furniture, but even when I give her toys, she still prefers the furniture right now. Anyway, it's so nice to see you again, and this episode will include works in progress. I don't have any finished objects to show you, but that's okay. As well as I'm going to answer a viewer question. I'm going about sock heels, and as a topic, I'm going to get a little more into colors and color palette and those kinds of things because you were all so wonderful in giving me suggestions and ideas and comments, and it seems like lots of people want me to talk about colors, so that might be a multi-part thing, we'll see. And finally, I have come across some knitting passages in my recreational reading lately, and so I will go ahead and read those to you. And the sun just came out. I want to apologize in advance if you can hear any hammering. Somewhere in my neighborhood, someone is having some kind of work done. I can't see it out my window, but it's been going on and off all day. And I really want to get this recorded because I couldn't record last week. So I've got all my windows closed, and I'm just going to hope for the best with them not being too enthusiastic with the hammering and that my sound editing can conquer. I'm sitting further back from the wall today because I noticed there were some sound issues last time too. I think I was too close to the windows. So, yeah, bear with me on that, and hopefully we can still have a fun episode. If you are wondering, I'm winding another ball of yarn. It's still Quint's turn in the basalt. This is when I realized I did not take any geology classes since I was about 8. Yeah, colorway for one of my sweaters, so that's what I'll be working on. I'm talking. Do let me know, though. I noticed when I was editing last time that I'm jiggling a bit, when I'm winding the yarn. So if that's making you seasick, I will stop winding yarn while recording these videos. I'm very prone to motion sickness and vertigo myself, so I don't want to be aggravating that with anyone. Okay, so works in progress. First up, I've almost completed the first of my mom's socks. The reason why I stopped before the cuff is that I'm using a contrast color for the heels, toe, and cuff, and I want to go ahead and use all that yarn up. So I'm going to knit the second sock with contrast heel and toe, and then weigh how much yarn I have left and just knit the cuff until all that is used up. And this is the stitch pattern from the Hermione's Everyday Socks, and I have adapted it to be toe up and to fit my mom, which is a 56 stitch count. And I did a short row toe that I talked about last time. I don't think I had the heel in last time. So the heel is a Fish Lips Kiss heel that I modified for more depth because my mom has fairly high arches. More on that later. And the yarn is Knit Picks Felici. Oh, I can't remember the colorway. That's bad. Anyway, and then this is Knit Picks Comfy Fingering, which is an acrylic cotton blend in sea glass for the contrast. And that is because my mom is very sensitive to wool, so there aren't very many wools that she can wear. Stroll, which is the regular Knit Picks Superwash Merino fingering, itches her, so. And yeah, pretty pleased with how it turned out. I only have one 50-gram ball, but that did get me all the way up here, so. I have been distracted by knitting sweaters for myself, though, which is why I haven't cast on. I did actually cast on for the second sock, but I did something wrong with the toe, and I realized it 4 rows from the end of the toe, and so I ripped it all out, and then I was just cranky and didn't want to start it again. It's been pretty chilly down in South Texas, though, so I'm sure my mom would appreciate another pair of wool socks, so hopefully I'll get back to that soon. Okay, so my other 2 works in progress are both sweaters. One of them you've seen before and one you haven't, so I guess I'll start with the new one first. Just realized that I haven't named this. Okay, let's call it the Witching Hour cardigan. So you have seen the swatch, and now I have a finished back piece. Don't know if you can see. There it is with the arm shaping and the waistband. a finished front piece, also with the arm shaping, and this time with a crew neck, as well as the waistband. And I've just started the second front. So I've just got the waistband done on that one. Well, I think I've got like 4 more rows on the waistband. I'm making a nice deep waistband because I find that sits really nicely and it lets me move around without the waistband climbing up me throughout the day. So, yeah, and I am making this up myself like I do most of my sweater patterns. And the band is just 2x1 rib, and I did the knit 1 twisted, purl 2, knit 1 twisted. And then the main pattern is Candle Flame from the Barbara Walker First Treasury of Knitted Stitches, something like that. It's also available online on knittingful.com, and I will include that link on my project page. It's this really beautiful pattern, and I know that some people are going to see leaves in it, but since it was called Candle Flame, I see that, and then it's slightly topsy-turvy, which reminds me a little of those witches' hats, and so that's why mine is the witching hour, especially in this color. You know, this is not really a leaf color. I'm having such a good time with this sweater. It's such a pleasure to knit. So I had knit a pretty extensive swatch, which I showed you on the last episode, and one of the reasons that made me choose Candle Flame for a sweater is that I knew it would be really easy to do the waist shaping in pattern. Oh, see, Moth is... She likes to snuggle with Thistle, and she's a little bit aggressive about her snugglings. Anyway, I knew that it would be really easy to do the waist shaping because this is one of those patterns, like leaf patterns, where you're doing yarn overs around a center stem or just line. The wick, that's what it is if it's candles. And so if you want to increase in pattern, all you have to do is start doing one of the yarn over bits and not have a complementary decrease section, and then you're going to end up with more stitches. So that is what I did. I tried it out on the swatch first, and because this is an alternating pattern, I did have to start the waist shaping in a slightly different place on either side of the back, but I think that that'll work out. I'm knitting it with just a slight amount of positive ease according to where I want the fabric to be when stretched. It's since these are knit, but there's purl columns in between, that makes it really stretchy. Anyway, so I'm not really worried about having a slightly staggered waist increase. It did mean that the waist increases went pretty quickly just because of the pattern, but I don't mind having a little bit of positive ease, especially around my rib cage. So yeah, it felt like such an intuitive knit. I had memorized the stitch pattern by the time I finished the swatch, and it's a 24 row repeat, and that ended up working really well. I like about 7.5 inches for my arm side, and that turned out to just be 3 of these, and then it also worked out because I did longer ribbing, and I like about 10 inches between my waist and the arm to also be 3 full repeats here, and so it was just a really neat and simple kind of calculation to do. At first I was a little worried about how I was going to measure gauge. That's why I knit such a large swatch. I can't remember if I talked last time about how I measured the gauge, so just in case I didn't, I'll talk about it here. And I don't have my swatch within arm's reach, but so what I did was I blocked the swatch, and that already kind of relaxed the ribbing so that it was a little bigger as opposed to being really snug up. And then I stretched it just to the point where I liked how it looked best. I didn't like it really stretched, but I liked it a little stretched so that you can see the purl columns. And I just went ahead and measured that. Like I stretched it next to a ruler's, and I knew how many stitches were in the swatch. Well, really I was thinking in terms of pattern repeats, but I also knew because it's a 12-stitch repeat for a pattern, which I also knew would be really easy to fit into sweater knitting, but I can go back to that in a second, talking about gauge right now. And so it turned out that I was going to be knitting it at right around 6.5 stitches per inch, which is the gauge that I tend to like in Quince & Company Turn, which is technically a fingering weight yarn. You get 220 yards to 50 grams, and it's 70% wool and 30% silk, but I really like how it knits up more as a sport weight. When I've tried to knit it more snugly, it's really difficult for me to get a tighter gauge, and I don't like the fabric as much. So yeah, this is it's my third Quince Turn sweater, and so that's why I'm becoming a little more familiar with that yarn, and this is one of my very favorite sweater yarns. And I mentioned that the colorway is Basalt, it's the rock. So yeah, that worked out really well. The other thing that I was going to tell you about is I knew that a 12 stitch repeat and then you do 2 extra stitches to mirror it because of the purl column would work out really well for the kind of strap left over from the neckband, because I know that I like that to be around 14 stitches when I'm knitting around this gauge. And so that was the other thing that made me really excited to turn this into a sweater. And as you can see, I'm doing a crew neck. So I started the bind off halfway between, at the halfway point of the full length between the arm side, because I like crew necks that still show my collarbone as opposed to very high ones. And I believe that that's about it. So it did occur to me, since this stitch pattern, it's a 12 stitch repeat, and that includes 2 of the candle flames. And so the back isn't centered. In order to center it, I would have had to include an extra candle stitch motif that didn't have any compensating increases or decreases. And normally I would be like, okay, well that's just going to be a few stitches here and there, and that'll be fine. It won't affect the overall fabric. But this stitch is unusual in that you don't do the same amount of decreases as increases on every row. And so even though it's a 12 stitch repeat, the row or the stitch count is often larger than that, which is why you get these wavy edges. And so because there was so much going on already with the different stitch count, I wanted the leaves to be balanced. So I didn't worry about centering the back, which you can see, but I still think it looks really good because I think this looks like an all-over texture pattern. With the fronts, it was easier to center, not center, but to make it look even. So what I'm going to do is, since there's the button band and that'll function as the center, I am going to mirror the front halves. And that does mean on this side I was able to do waist shaping that completely mirrors the back one. Well, doesn't mirror it, but it compensates for it. So, but on the other side I'll be doing the same increasing, and so that's why the waist increases will be a little bit different on one side than the other, but it's only a question of, I think, 6 or 12 rows. So, knitting is stretchy. It's forgiving. If that made no sense, I apologize. It just seems like a lot of you really enjoy delving into a lot of detail with me, so that's why I go for it. But yeah, and the reason why I decided to do 2x1 ribbing is that I knew that I wanted the purl columns in the pattern, the candle flame pattern, to be continuous with the waistbands. And I also knew that I wanted these early candles to have a wick that was continuous with the waistband as well. So when I was doing the calculations, and I assumed I was knitting it around 6.5 stitches to the inch, as I said, it turned out that it would be the stitch count that I wanted for the snuggest part of the waist. Basically, if I decreased each of the 12 stitch repeats to 10 stitches, then that would make the difference. So I decided that in the one that was going to immediately start with the yarn over increases, so look like a candle flame from the beginning, I kept the purl columns as 2, but in the one that was going to get small first, I decreased those purl columns to 1 stitch each. So that's how I took the 2 stitches out of each repeat. And since I did a wide waistband, the smallest part of my waist is higher up, and then, it gets bigger as it starts to move into my hips. So I wanted more fabric down at the bottom than in the middle at the smallest part of my waist. So that's why I just started with 2 purl columns all the way, and then when I got about halfway up, I decreased to the 1 stitch purl columns. Every other motif, essentially. And I really enjoy working out how to make ribbing grow into stitch patterns. And this one turned out to be quite simple, as I said. I just did the math kind of actually as I was running a shower and then getting in the shower. I really like it when I can put my decreases in purl columns because I find that it's usually less noticeable. And so that, I think, is all the details that I've done so far on the candle flame on the Witching Hour sweater. Oh, the other thing I want to say was that, so usually I swatch and then I start knitting with that ball of yarn, but because I swatched with some extra yarn, I now know that 100 grams, which is 2 skeins of yarn, will finish the back and get up to here on one of the fronts, which I think is interesting because trying to figure out how much yarn I use in different parts of sweaters, I just find it useful for calculating what I need to buy for future sweater projects. So yeah, it's good to finally know that. I'm going to go ahead and weigh this yarn at the end, this ball of yarn, and then I'll know about how many grams it takes to knit a sweater, especially since I'm knitting my sweaters at a larger size than I used to. I'm aiming for around 35 inches at the bust now instead of 33 because I've gained some weight. And I have realized that I also just like having a slightly more fabric going on at the bust. And yeah, so I plan to I'm pretty much knitting monogamously on this one at this point, and I'm really hoping over the weekend to get the second front done. The fronts always go fastest, and get a good start on the sleeve. And I plan to just do the sleeves in the round bottom up with a sleeve cap. Although now that I'm saying that, I'm torn because maybe I should knit them top down to maximize length again, the way I just did with the sweater that I knit. I'll have to decide that later. Okay, final work in progress is my Hedgerow cardigan. And this is at the stage where I'm doing embroidery instead of knitting, which is why I needed to cast on for the Witching Hour cardigan. So I can't remember what it looked like when I showed it to you last time, but I finished knitting both the sleeves down to the cuffs. I plan to add any yarn that's left over to them to make them longer later, which is why they're still on waste yarn. And I started with the embroidery on the elbow patches because once I've done the elbow patches, I can go ahead and seam it together because it's so much easier to embroider flat fabric than in the round fabric. So I finished embroidering the elbow patches last night, and I've seamed half. So this half looks like a sweater, and this half still looks like an origami project. And this is knit out of Quince & Company Finch, which is their fingering weight 100% wool yarn in the colorway Sage. And it's another pattern that I'm making up myself, but this stitch pattern is from the Japanese Knitting Bible book. I always knew that I wanted to use this yarn as a contrast color because this is Odwin. It's also Quince & Company Finch, and I am inspired by kind of those early spring flowers that are white, like lilies of the valley and snowdrops, and I really love how this kind of off-white plays with the sage color. I think it's a really beautiful combination. It's also a combination that I've seen on a few houses in my neighborhood that have like plaster walls, and I really love it there too. And I decided that since I was going with a floral type theme, it would be nice to have a darker green too. I also just really enjoy tonal combinations. So I was thinking I was going to use Cascade Heritage Silk in Pine, which I have left over from a pair of socks that I knit. But when I started to embroider on my practice swatch, and I posted the photo on Instagram so I can insert it here, I discovered that that colorway was not dark enough. There wasn't enough contrast, and so you couldn't really see it next to the sage. So luckily, I have this skein of Knit Pick Stroll in the Aurora Heather, which I ordered for socks for Joel. And it's a pretty dark green, and so that provided enough contrast. So I'm very new to embroidery, so I was knitting up practice embroidery bits on this swatch that I have not yet dismantled, just so that there would be less cutting out of threads on the actual sweater. And this is the one that's inspired most by like snowdrops and lilies of the valley and that kind of shape. And then I also found this article that was telling me how to do vines, which I had fun with, and then This is a spiderweb rose, which is I really enjoyed that. And then this is just a little leaf that I was trying out. And this is the second version. I tried out some other stuff too and then clipped it out. And I can insert those photos there. And so I still haven't really decided what I'm going to do on the fronts. I have 4 diamonds on each front, and so I could alternate different florals. I know that I definitely want to do the French knots here and the little leaf patterns on the side, and that is taken from the Innsbruck leg warmers and mittens pattern, which I knit last year and which inspired me to do this type of project, Tyrolean knitting. And I loved how it turned out, so I knew that I wanted to do that again. So that was the easy choice. But yeah, I am still kind of putting off that final decision on the fronts, just because I do like how they all look, but I'm not sure that they all go together that well. I don't know. I'm torn. But, so, as I said, I wanted to start the embroidery with the elbow patches, and I decided to just go ahead and do vines on those. And I did add smaller spiderweb leaves. So here is the first one. Oh, hang on. Sorry. So this is the first elbow patch. Actually, that might be the second one. And let's see, where's my other sleeve? Yeah. And this is the other one. So the reason why, isn't it weird how big it looks when it's flat, but then how small it is when it's seamed up? These are actually snugger sleeves than I had planned, but I'll talk about that in some future episode. Anyway, so when I started the embroidery, I started with this one, and you might be able to see that it's very even and small and neat, and that's because I took thread and did guidelines, because I couldn't find my water-soluble marker, and followed those. And that took a really long time, and it was really fiddly, and so I decided to just kind of wing it for this one and see if I liked that look, and I actually really like how it looks a bit more organic. So then on the second sleeve, I just winged it for both of them, and they don't look as neat and uniform, but I like that. I like the kind of quirky aspect, and I think it looks more hand-done because it's a little more irregular. I know that associating handmade things with imperfect things is not good, and that's not what I mean. I just mean, if things are being made by a machine, then they're going to have a much more uniform appearance, whereas this has a more variable appearance. That's how I should phrase it. Yeah, and I found it a much more pleasant process. I was less stressed. I was just enjoying myself more, which is important with knitting. So I'm really pleased with how these turned out. Can't wait to seam up the other half so that I can try it on. And then what I'll probably do is go ahead and knit the neckband and the button bands, which I couldn't do before I had seamed it up. Well, I guess I could have, but I don't see the point of that. Because that way all the knitting will be done, and it'll give me a nice break from the embroidery. I doubt that the embroidery will go that quickly just because I have neck and shoulder problems. I have chronic illnesses, and so projects that require me to look at them, I can only work on in small doses. That's why I trained myself to knit without looking, is so that I don't have to have my neck bent like that. So this will be a slow but steady type sweater. Hopefully I can show it to you in, I don't know, like a fortnight or so. But I'm pretty thrilled with how, I love these cables already, but then once you add embroidery to them, I don't know, they just look so neat. I love that tradition. As I said, I still haven't really decided what I'm going to do for these center motifs. I feel like, because there's 4, I could either do 2 different motifs, right, alternating them, or do the top and bottom as one, and then the 2 center ones as another one. Or I can do 4 different motifs. So let me know if you have an opinion, because, as I said, I'm going to be knitting the neckband and button bands next, so I probably won't be getting back to the embroidery until Monday at the earliest. So I would love to hear from you if you have an opinion. And those are all my works in progress. I scooted my chair over a little so you can see all the adorable snuggling happening behind me. They are close friends. Well, they're more like siblings. Usually they get along, sometimes they fight. But, and by fight, I just blip, blip, blip. Nope. I moved my chair over a little so that you could see the moth and thistle snuggling that is happening on the bed, because I know a lot of you guys are fans of them. So next I thought I would answer a viewer question about heels, and she suggested that I talk about different heels in different segments, so that's what I'm going to do. It'll be a multi-part answer. And since I have my mom's sock with me, today I'm going to talk about fish lips kiss heels and other short row heels. So for me, the major advantage of a short row heel is that it doesn't add any stitches to the body of your sock. And if you're knitting a self-striping or even a variegated yarn, those yarns are going to look different depending on what your stitch count is, right? So in the case of a self-striping, the stripes are wider, the fewer stitches there are. So if I had done a traditional heel on this sock, and I'd increased my stitch count by, let's see, usually it would be, I don't know, like, I can't remember how many decreases I usually do in a gusset, but it feels like it's at least 10, so that's at least 20 stitches. Then that means that when I'm decreasing for the gusset, so right around here, those stitches would be more narrow, or those stripes would be more narrow, and that would drive me crazy. I know some people aren't bothered by that, and that's great for them. I'm not bothered by it on other people's socks. It just bothers me on my own socks, and my mom, I asked her, and she definitely prefers the uniform stripes as well. So that is why I do short row heels on self-striping and sometimes on variegated yarn. It depends. And so the way that a short row heel is worked, and it doesn't actually matter. So the other nice thing about short row heels is that they're the same whether you're going top down or bottom up. So if you know how to do one, then you don't have to change your method at all depending on which direction you're knitting your sock in. So all you do is you take the sole stitches and then you work back and forth doing wraps, so your rows are getting smaller and smaller, and then once you hit a certain number in the center, you start incorporating those stitches back in. So that's why it's called a short row heel, is because you're using wraps to make sure that there's no hole. It's really easy to do a contrast colored heel in this as well, just because the heel is very self-contained, and so you just start with the new color and then bring the old color back in. And the problem with short row heels, not really the problem, the downside for me of short row heels is that since they don't add any extra stitches, the sock isn't as big in the instep, which is basically where your arch is. And if you have a low arch, that's not really a problem. But if you have a higher arch, which I do, and most of the people I knit socks for do, like a medium to high, that can mean that the sock is pulled really tight over the instep. And so what I do in order to get more depth in the short row heel, and why it looks kind of weird, right, is so there are two ways that you can add depth. The depth is going to come from knitting more rows, right? And so you can either increase stitches at the beginning, because then first your heel's a little bigger and it gives you more stitches to wrap, so you can add more rows that way, or you can decrease to a smaller amount of stitches in the center. And that depends on how narrow or wide your heel is. My mom happens to have quite narrow heels, so I do both for her. I increase stitches here, and then I just decrease them at the end. And I also go down to a smaller width than the pattern suggests. This is a $1 paid for pattern, which is why I'm not going into really specific details. And that helps the heel fit really well. She actually really likes the other pair of socks that I knit her. She said that they fit great, but it definitely took some experimenting to get a short row heel that fits as well as a traditional heel flap and heel turn. So for me, the only time I use a short row heel, and I use the Fish Lips Kiss heel one just because it was the second short row heel that I tried, and I liked it, so that's why I haven't tried any others. So for me, I only use it when I'm trying to preserve a pattern in a sock, just because I prefer the fit of a traditional heel flap and gusset, and I also enjoy knitting it more. I think it's more fun. But I am really glad that I have this in my arsenal for these specific types of socks. And the other time when I can see a short row heel really coming in handy is if you're doing color work and you don't want to figure out how to do gusset decreases in pattern for the color work. But I personally would not use a short row heel in a color work sock because color work makes your fabric less stretchy, and so if you already have a little less space in the instep and then you do a heel that doesn't give you any extra space, trying to get that sock on is going to be more of a challenge. Let's see. If you are, it's really simple to substitute a short row heel into any pattern that calls for a regular heel, like the heel flap and gusset heel. All you do is you keep in mind that the short row heel is a lot shorter than a heel flap and gusset. So if you're knitting top down, you want to knit longer on the leg, and if you're knitting a pattern sock, you want to stop about an inch beforehand and only have stockinette here. You might see that I forgot to do that on this sock, but I don't think it'll bother my mom too much. So when the pattern says that you should start knitting your gusset, instead knit the full leg for about another inch or two, and then take the back leg stitches, I'm assuming we're knitting top down, and just go ahead and substitute in your preferred short row heel. And then once you have finished your short row heel, pick up with the regular sock pattern and just ignore any gusset decrease directions. So usually the traditional heel flap and gusset pattern will have directions for the instep or the top of the sock, directions for the gusset decreases, and then directions for the sole. So you can just ignore the gusset bit because you don't need that. And if you are doing a toe-up sock and you want to substitute a short row heel in for a traditional heel flap and gusset, most toe-up gussets you do increases in the body to form the gusset, and so don't do those. And just knit until basically your heel would start. Like if you try the sock on, knit until it's long enough so that just the ball of your heel is unsocked, if that makes sense. And then once again, just take your sole stitches and do the heel, and once you're done with it, you can start the leg, and you'll be able to follow the directions in those patterns pretty simply because the gusset was increased, not decreased. So the leg you should be able to follow as normal, just keeping in mind that that first inch or so you're going to want to keep plain stockinette on the back of the sock, which, once again, I forgot to do because it's been a while since I've done this kind of heel. And that is how you would substitute in a short row heel for a traditional heel flap and gusset. I have not knit an afterthought heel, but I think all you would do to substitute that in is in the pattern, the row that says, you know, put waste yarn in or do something to mark that it's going to be an afterthought heel. Instead of doing that, you would just work your short row heel. And other than that, the direction should be the same because in that case, you're just knitting a tube, so there's no stitch increases or decreases. Yeah, so it's pretty simple to substitute heel patterns in once you have your preferred heel. If you need to increase or decrease a few stitches, that works out well. You don't feel it when you're wearing the sock. And just get the stitch count that you need. I hope that that was clear. If you have any questions, definitely ask them, either here on YouTube or over on the Ravelry comments thread, and I will try to get into more details about that. But yeah, it's a pretty straightforward thing to substitute out heels as long as you're just aware of what parts your heel might not necessarily come with. So in the case of putting in a short row heel, that means you don't have to worry about gussets at all. I'm now repeating myself, so we're going to move on. Now I'm going to read to you. So this book is called The Glasstown Game, and it's by Katherine M Valenti, who's one of my very favorite authors. This is one of her newer books, and it is put out by Children's Press. I think because the main characters are children, I would say that this is just as appealing to adults, and there are some difficult bits in the book that might disturb like a really sensitive kid. I don't know. I feel like a lot of classic children's literature, sad things happen anyway. But I don't know. I have no clue what your kid likes to read or not. Anyway, so this book is about 4 siblings named Charlotte, Emily, Anne, and Bramwell. And if that sounds familiar, that is because they are indeed the Brontes. And usually I'm really hesitant about fiction that fictionalizes real people because I think it's kind of rude. I feel like real people are entitled to their real thoughts, and authors putting thoughts in their head is a little questionable. But in this case, I thought it was so beautifully done, and I feel like Valenti clearly loves the Brontes and has read a lot about them and was very true to their spirit, and it's when they're children, and so I had no problem with it here. And the idea is that the Brontes in real life had their own imaginary world. They played a lot of imagination games, as you might expect, and so in this novel, the premise is that they find themselves in that world, and then they have adventures there. And it's wonderful. I can't recommend it enough. Her writing, first, the prose is delicious. Her sentences are like eating chocolate truffles. They're just such a pleasure, and they feel so decadent. And also, she's extremely good at writing nuanced, lovable, but far from perfect characters, and especially her children's characters. I don't know, they're people, but they're not adult people, and I think that that's a tricky thing to get, and she just, every time I read one of her books with children, I'm like, ugh, I remember being a child, and this just, it feels so true. And her plots are always full of, like, heartbreak and uplifting, and I don't know, she's just a wonderful writer. I highly recommend her. Her other children's series is the Fairyland Series, and it starts with the girl who circumnavigated Fairyland in a ship of her own making, and I've read to you from that series as well. So, okay, as you might imagine, with the Brontes and Wuthering Heights, there's definitely knitting in this book, so I will go ahead and read you some passages. But first, my nose is really itchy. Sorry. This always happens when I podcast. Okay. So this is from the beginning, when they're still in the regular world. One rare evening, Papa and Aunt Elizabeth and Tabitha sat in the red-rugged parlor by the fire, going about their mystifying old people games, knitting, sewing, and tidying the books. Anne had only recently come to understand that tidying the books didn't mean Papa sat in his big cocoa-colored chair in the night, dusting up the corners in Mr. Coleridge's poetry or soaping down the fairies in Mr. Shakespeare's plays, but something or other to do with money and making more of it come in than go out. Aunt Elizabeth held up a lace shawl to the firelight. The pattern was so fine it looked like the flames themselves. Emily gave a strangled little sigh of envy. Aunt Elizabeth had such a clever hand with everything. She could make a dirty old piece of string into a ball gown if she had a mind to. Emily could hardly manage socks without help with the blasted heel. But she immediately regretted making any noise at all. So that was the little knitting section from there. And let's see, I know that I marked a few more. I just have to find them. Oh, okay, so one of the things about their imaginary world is that words are more literal there than they are here, so I thought this one was funny. They've just learned that there are blue stockings in the Glasstown world. Charlotte and Emily turned away from the porthole, startled by the word. But we have blue stockings. They're clever ladies who gathered together to do literature instead of needlework, said Charlotte, who admired them terribly. Westminster Abbey shook its head. The suitcase scoffed. Blue stockings are a race of one-legged indigo silk imps who rule the plaid lands with a wild and rollicking hand, answering to no man, chanting their feelings in pentameter, and knitting fine new children whenever and if ever they want them. They average 2.5 meters tall. Their capital is Montague, and the current queen of the blues is called Wollstonecraft, aged 17 2/5, and she is 3 meters tall. Perhaps we shall see some as we make our way through the swamp. The proper collective noun is a protest of blue stockings. Proper language is dreadfully important in these parts, you understand. So, also knitting related. Katherine Valenti herself is a knitter, so I think that's part of why she puts lots of stuff in. Let's see. I think those are the only ones that I bookmarked. Their suitcase ends up using their knitting needles and things to make other objects, so that's fun, but I will not share that with you because I did not mark it. So the final thing that I will read to you is the about the author. Maybe. Oh, my Kindle is rebelling. Go to about the author. Here we go. Katherine M Valenti is a New York Times best-selling author of fantasy and science fiction novels, short stories, and poetry. She's been nominated for the Hugo, Nebula, and World Fantasy Awards and has won the Locus and Andre Norton Awards. She lives on a small island off the coast of Maine with her partner, 2 dogs, 1 enormous cat, a less enormous cat, 6 chickens, a red accordion, an uncompleted master's degree, a room full of yarn, a spinning wheel with ulterior motives, a cupboard of jam and pickles, a bookshelf full of folk tales, an industrial torch, and an Oxford English dictionary. So obviously it's the yarn and spinning wheel that made me want to read that to you as well. So that was a nice interlude of words I didn't have to think up and could just read out loud. Really quickly, I thought I would share my little sweater scheming. I've been on such a sweater kick lately. I just want to knit them all the time. And a few episodes back, I did a Schrödinger sweater segment about all the purple yarn in my life at the moment. And I've come to a decision about some of the yarns. I wanted to share that with you. So you were all so clever with your advice, and a couple of you suggested that I go into my closet and look at what clothes I would wear with a purple sweater and decide whether solid or patterned would be most useful. And I realized that I need at least one solid purple sweater, need being a relative term, because I have a plaid purple skirt that I really like to wear, my old purple cardigan that I unraveled with, and I have several patterned dresses that a solid purple sweater would go really well with. So I went ahead and earmarked the Quince & Company Finch in Damson, which is a dark purple, to be solid, and that's because I knew that I had 5 skeins of that, whereas the mauve yarn I had pulled out of another sweater, and you always tend to lose a little yarn when you're frogging, and I'd actually run out of yarn when knitting that first sweater too. So I decided that Damson would be a solid colored yarn, but that left Quince & Company Turn and Dusk, which is the mauve yarn, for me to do whatever I wanted. And I have chosen to do a colorwork sweater. So I'm really excited about it because it will be my first, I guess not my first colorwork cardigan, but my first where I'm incorporating several different colors instead of neutrals and that kind of thing. And the whole body will be multiple colors. The other 2 that I've done are just yolks. So I swatched for it, and that's what I had wanted to show you. It's just a little baby swatch because it's a design idea swatch, not a gauge swatch. But I love how it looks so much. So first of all, I'll show you the pattern. I am adapting the Whitby Stockings pattern from the book Vintage Modern Knits, which is actually, remember I told you that I took the one embroidery idea from the Innsbruck Mittens and Leg Warmers? There they are. I love this book. The aesthetic matches my aesthetic so nicely. And I just realized that the colors right here are quite close to my 2 contrast colors in my swatch. Anyway, so I love these stockings. One day I will knit these stockings in exactly these colors because I think this is a perfect color combination. But I've been wanting to adapt this into a cardigan for a very long time. And I was thinking that I would spend my Quince & Company gift card on yarn. In order to do that, I was thinking I would do a paler pink and then maybe like a fox russety orange because I like those 2 colors together. But then it occurred to me that I have yarn in my stash and I should probably knit with that first. And so then I decided that I definitely wanted to use Dusk, which is this mauve, as the primary color. And my plan is to do the body in the stripes and then just have solid sleeves and a solid waistband, solid neckband, button band, that kind of thing. So it'll be primarily mauve, and the other 2 will definitely be the contrast colors. And I've also been watching the cartoon Hilda, which if you haven't seen it on Netflix, I'd actually read the graphic novel it's based on, but it is a delight. You should watch it. If you have kids, I'm sure they'll love it, but I watched it by myself and I loved it, and several of my friends are also watching it just for themselves and love it as well. And in Hilda, she has teal hair during the day, but in the evenings it becomes mauve, and the color palette in the show is just wonderful in general. But in the evenings, her hair becomes mauve, and then a lot of the world becomes kind of berry colored. And so that made me think about how much I like those two colors together. And then I happen to have a little bit of Quince & Company Finch in Honey left, which is this like yellow-green color. And I thought that it looked really nice with the dusk. So I was thinking that the three would make a nice combination. And Quince & Company just added new colors to their turn line, and one of them is a kind of berry colored. So I was just going to buy it. But then I remembered that I have two skeins of Quince & Company Turn in the Oyster colorway, which is a really lovely, very pale silver, but it is too icy for me to wear. And anytime I try to put it in color work with my muted colors, it just like dominates the muted colors, and I never like how it looks. I've had this yarn. It was actually in my very first Quince order ever because I didn't have my color cards yet. So I've had this yarn for 4 years, and I've tried to knit with it on several different occasions, and it's just not going to happen. So I've decided to over dye it. And so, but I wanted to swatch and make sure that I liked the colors first. I'm not sure how true they're going to show. I wanted to make sure that the berry color didn't kind of overwhelm the mauve and make the mauve look gray, because I really want that like delicate purple coloring to go through. And I don't know if it's showing on camera, but in real life it still looks like a lovely pale purple, and the berry just really brings it out. And the berry makes the honey move more yellow versus green because it looks different in different lights. And I love the result. And the yarn that I use to swatch with is Hebridean 2-ply in Erica, which is one of my favorite colors from that yarn. It's the Alice Starmore color line, and it's just like the perfect plum. And a lot of her colors are really heathered, but this one is less heathered. So I thought I could probably manage to dye a similar color. I'm sure it won't be quite as beautiful, and it won't have quite as much depth, but you know, I feel I can get close. Purples and reds are the easiest colors to dye if you prefer using food safe dyes, because Kool-Aid comes in lots of reds, and it also comes in grape. So yeah, I just wanted to knit up a swatch beforehand so that I didn't dye a whole skein of yarn and then realize that I didn't like the results. But now I know that I do, so I'm really excited. I'm going to probably start my dye pots once I have finished this recording and try to get this color. The fun thing about dyeing is that if you don't like the color the first time, you just add the yarn back to a pot and add more color. So I find it's a really low risk thing as long as you don't felt your yarn. But now I know to just make sure that all my water stays the same temperature, and I haven't had any issues with that in a long time. And yeah, I'm just really excited about this. So this will be the sweater that I start once I finish my witching hour sweater. So hopefully within like a couple more weeks. And this will be a fun test for me because I am never sure if multicolored sweaters are going to be as versatile in my wardrobe as solid colored ones. So that's why I want to knit this next, just so that I can see how it wears. And I also wanted to choose 3 proper colors instead of neutrals as kind of a challenge to myself, and also because I happen to enjoy wearing several different types of neutrals. I think we're transitioning into color talk, by the way. So I enjoy navy blue, I enjoy grays, and I also enjoy browns, both like taupes and chocolate browns. And this mauve is a color that I like equally with all of those neutrals. So I wanted to make sure that the other 2 colors that I did I felt would look equally good. And so I've been holding it up to different neutrals, and I really like the results for everything. And I know that in this swatch it looks like the plum is going to dominate because it is darker. But I think that with the finished sweater, where there's going to be so much more mauve in the sleeves and everything, they'll end up balancing each other out. I'm trying to decide, this is all the honey I have, I feel like it might be enough to get through the body because there's only 5 rows out of 24 that have this in it. So that's like 20%. And you take off the waistband yarn, and if it takes like 130 grams for me to knit a body of a sweater, like I feel like maybe I could make it. So I might just start knitting and try it and see, although then I'm risking dye lot changes. But I really want to get this knit, so. I do have 2 skeins of the oyster, so I could try to dye this color as well, but I feel like this is a more tricky color to dye. And I can always just order it from Quinn's, so we'll see how that goes. I like to wait until I have a nice big order because then shipping is less expensive per skein of yarn. And I believe that usually over Thanksgiving weekend, Quince & Company offers free shipping if you spend a certain amount of yarn. So I am hoping to wait to place an order with them until then. But I want this sweater to be knit earlier than that, so we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I'm really excited. I'm going to call it my tea party sweater. It's so fun designing things. I highly recommend it. If I can do it, you can do it. I don't have any like special skill or knowledge. I have just read books by very skillful and knowledgeable knitters, and then I just do what they tell me to. So moving on to colors. Lots of episodes ago, I talked about the idea of seasonal color palettes and how essentially the season part is just kind of a shorthand for talking about dividing colors by 3 different characteristics. The first is whether they're warm or cool. The second is whether they are light or dark. And the third is whether they are muted or saturated. And I feel like that is like the most complicated to explain. But, oh, I'm not wearing any teal today. But okay, so like these colors right here, like this one, it's not that it's that much lighter than the blue of my cowl. However, it's much brighter, right? Like because it has more of that aqua color in it, whereas this blue has more gray in it, which makes it more muted. So hopefully that makes sense. And I came across this idea when I was like 24, 25, and now I'm 32. So it's been quite a few years, and it instantly clicked with me because my coloring is very much suited to muted colors, and I get washed out by any kind of bright colors, like any kind of saturated ones. So right now, at least when I'm looking at the screen, I'm looking at these aquas. I'm not looking at my face, right? Just because the aquas are so much stronger. Even though some people might call them pastels, especially this one, it's still too saturated for my coloring. And so I've been trying to figure out how to sort what color suited me, but I hadn't thought of it in terms of muted or saturated before. And as soon as I came across that, it all clicked into place. And so there are 2 different palettes that are focused around muted colors. One of them is warmer and one of them is cooler. And after some experimenting, I realized that I fall into the cooler camp, mainly because yellows are not my friend. I love a lot of shades of yellow, so I would try on yellow clothes. I don't know, this probably isn't going to show it because it's not big enough, but when I put on like a yellow blouse, then my skin just starts to look not its best, a little bit jaundiced. So that's how I ended up choosing a more muted, cool palette, and the name of that in this system is called Soft Summer. And the wonderful thing about choosing a palette where all the colors have certain things in common is that then they all go together. And so what I love about that is I like variety in my colors, and that means that rather than picking 1 or 2 neutrals and 1 or 2 colors, I can have a few pieces of clothing in all of the neutrals and colors, and they all go together. So like this blue, it goes with gray, but it also goes with my browns and with my navy blues. because they're all fundamentally kind of muted and kind of cool. And so it makes mixing colors a lot easier if you enjoy having a variety. And for me, color is a major factor in how I get dressed. It's why I like having a big closet, is so that I can wear different colors depending on my mood. And usually when I'm deciding what to wear for the day, I decide based on color first. And I know that different people have different priorities there, but that's just how I get dressed. I have drawn a lot of inspiration from a certain soft summer board on Pinterest, and I will go ahead and link that below. And one of the ideas with my particular palette is kind of tonal variation. And that's what you see here, where there's like 2 different shades of purple, or like the 2 different shades of gray here, even if this is really a silver. Oh, the sun came back out. And so when I mix colors together, I really like mixing different tones of the same color. So that is where I ended up finding the inspiration for my color palette. So as far as, so there were a few questions about that. First, like, I think, was it always my favorite? No. Before I read these articles and found this concept, I liked pretty much all colors equally. My closet was a rainbow, and it had brights and mutes and warms and cools, and once, for me, once I found this, I immediately wanted to only wear my most flattering colors, but I don't think that everyone has to do that. So if you're trying to find a color palette that makes you happy, it might mix and match, right? Like you might enjoy wearing both muted and bright colors. And of course, it's always a spectrum. But, so I would say don't feel boxed in. If the idea works for you, then it's a really easy way to make sure that clothing items are versatile and mix and match. But if you just want to have one outfit and that's the way you always wear that dress, then that's just as functional. I don't think things have to mix and match. For me, I fell in love with these colors once I saw what they did for my skin, and the more that I bought them, the more that I love how they look mixed together. And I also just, in general, I've always been more drawn to muted colors than bright colors, even though I did have some bright ones in my closet. But I have never been like a neon person or like those really bright primaries. I've never been drawn to those. In my decorating, I always tend towards more muted, soft colors too, although I tend to decorate with warmer colors than I wear. But so in that sense, yes, I already had kind of an instinctive attraction to those palettes. But I also like really dark jewel tones as well that don't always fit. So there are colors that I love that I don't wear because they're not the most flattering option for me, but I like to incorporate them in other places. And I definitely have come to love my palette more and more the more that I live with it. And so for me, and the thing is that these palettes are still very extensive. You're not limited to just a handful of colors. If it was that kind of limiting, then I would not enjoy it. So I do think that that's one way that you can create a color palette. But if that doesn't appeal to you, then you can just do it the other way and figure out what some of your favorite colors are to wear, and not in a general sense, like pink. Instead, figure out, oh, are you more of a blush fan? If you like blush, do you like more of the cool pink blushes or more of the peach blushes? If you like darker pinks, is it more of a magenta or is it more that like tea rose color? So there's a lot of nuance within that. And that can really help you decide what colors you're most drawn to and see if you find a common pattern. And it doesn't matter if they all have the same characteristic as long as you have neutrals or other colors, if you like mixing a lot of colors, that go with them. So that would be the other way that you can kind of plan your colors is instead of making sure that everything in your closet mix and matches with each other, maybe you love magenta, but you only like it when you wear it with navy blue. And so you just know that if you have a magenta blouse, then you need to have a pair of navy blue trousers or a skirt, whatever you like to wear. And then you'll always have something to wear with that blouse. So that you can think more in terms of outfits. rather than a mix and match wardrobe. And I think that those are equally valid ways to approach colors. And from a hand knitting perspective, I think that it's good to think about what kind of colors you enjoy knitting with. If you enjoy knitting more with neutrals, then that means that maybe you have more colors that you can wear with your neutral hand knits if you want to be able to mix them together. And if you enjoy knitting with colors, then you know that you need to make sure that your non-knit wardrobe has more neutrals so that you can combine them into outfits. And this is always assuming that you like to wear neutrals and colors together. If you want to wear magenta from head to toe, more power to you. I think that's great. So, wow, that was really rambly. I apologize. I should have outlined that ahead of time. But essentially, for me at least, having a defining palette makes it a lot easier to make sure that my hand knits get the most possible wear. But I also really enjoy having a lot of different colors. Basically, I want to knit myself a cardigan in every single one of the colors in my palette. And then maybe some color work ones too, just because I love having those options. But that doesn't mean that my way is the only way, and I'm sure my closet, like space, there's only a certain amount of physical space that you have, so at that point you have to decide what you want to prioritize as far as what kind of variety gets you the most. Like, obviously, I don't do a lot of shape variety. Pretty much all my cardigans are cropped, and they're all on the more fitted side. And I'm thinking about doing a longer, slouchier cardigan one of these days, but not until I have more cropped ones. Just because those are the ones that I have found are most useful. So I have kind of a uniform as far as shapes go, and then vary it a lot with color. You might prefer to only wear 3 or 4 colors, but vary it a lot with shape or texture or those kinds of things. And let's see. Yeah, so that answered whether it was always my favorite and how I came to it. And yeah, if you have any more questions about color, then feel free to leave them below. I find that for me, there was one other thing I wanted to talk about. So I order a lot of my yarn online. And for Quince & Company, I have their color cards, although at this point I bought them a few years ago, so they don't show all the colors. But a lot of times you can't get color cards, right? Or you don't want to spend the $20 if you don't know if you're going to knit with that yarn a lot. So in that case, what I do is I go to Ravelry and I do a search for the yarn in that particular colorway, and then I look at every single project. And because different colors are taken in different lights, right? So you need to kind of develop an average in your mind. And if I've knit with a different color in that same yarn, I'll try to find a project that combines both the color I know and the color I'm thinking about so that I can kind of see by comparison whether I think it's going to flatter me or not. But yeah, so that's my main resource if I don't have color cards. And then my other thing is, if a yarn arrives and it's the wrong color, it's either too bright or too warm to flatter me, that's what over-dyeing is for. So I just pop it in a pot with some Kool-Aid or some Wilton's icing dye and kind of tweak it until it gets to a more usable state for me. I haven't had to do that with a sweater's quantity. That would be a lot trickier because I only have a stock pot. So getting a sweater's quantity of yarn in the stock pot all at once would be a challenge. But especially with accessories and that kind of thing, it's really doable. And since I use food safe dyes, I don't have to have any extra special equipment. So that's something that you could do too if you realize that you've ordered yarn the wrong. The one thing is, to work with Kool-Aid and Wilton's icing dye, it has to be a protein fiber, so it has to have wool, silk, nylon, that kind of thing. You can't do it with cotton. But yeah, so that's how I order yarn online. If I'm not sure what the color is, I go to Ravelry and stalk everyone's projects. Whew. That was a lot of talking. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. Moth and Thistle are pretty snug napping up there, so I'm not going to disturb them to say goodbye. And I'm rudely looking at this box. So I'm also going to be doing a new board game review, and it's going to be of Evolution: The Beginning, in case you're interested. This is a really fun one for animals, if you're an animal lover, and on the knitting scale, you can definitely knit while playing this game because everyone takes their own turn, so you can knit while someone else is doing their turn. The more players you have, the more time you're going to get to knit, obviously, because the longer it's going to take to get to your turn. But it's doable. So, after that little plug, I will just say goodbye. And if you want to keep up with me in the meantime, I'm the Charm of It over on Instagram as well as on Ravelry. And as always, I love hearing from you, so feel free to comment in YouTube or on Ravelry. I include a link to the comments thread down below. And I try to include details on all my project pages of things I've talked about on the podcast, but if you go to the project page and it's not there, feel free to ask and I will include the link. Sometimes I forget things. I do try to limit my computer time just because of my chronic illnesses, so that's why I don't always want to have to copy the same link 4 times, so that's why I prefer that you check the project page first, but I completely understand if you can't find something and Google isn't cooperating for you. So, until next time, I hope that you're enjoying your knitting, and thanks again for tuning in. Bye!